Hey, welcome back. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of one of history's most secretive networks, the Underground Railroad. Imagine an invisible web of safe houses and secret codes, where a single song could be a map and a quilt could be a signal for life or death. Over the next 2 hours, we'll follow the path of thousands who risked everything to follow a single star in the sky, the North Star, on a journey from the deep American South to the frozen borders of Canada. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of how ordinary people broke the law to save humanity. But before we go deeper, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I'd love to check the comments and see where in the world you're joining us from tonight. Between 1790 and 1860, the United States operated under a legal system that defined millions of black people, not as citizens, not as workers, but as property. This was chattel slavery. The term comes from the word chattel, meaning movable personal property. Under this system, enslaved people had the same legal status as livestock or furniture. They could be bought, sold, used as collateral for loans, passed down through wills, and seized to pay off debts. They had no legal right to marry, own property, testify in court, or sign contracts. The brutality of this legal system showed up in the most disturbing ways. In 1830, a Virginia court heard a case that revealed just how completely enslaved people were treated as property. A woman named Peggy had been owned by a plantation owner who loved to gamble. One night, after a series of bad hands at cards, he ran out of money. Rather than leave the table, he bet Peggy. He lost. The court ruled that Peggy now belonged to the card game, winner. She was literally lost in a poker game, and the law saw nothing wrong with this. Peggy had worked on the same plantation her entire life. She had children there. None of that mattered. A judge signed the papers, and she was taken away to pay off her owner's gambling debt. This was not unusual. Enslaved people were regularly used as collateral for loans, seized by courts to settle debts, and divided up in wills like furniture or livestock. Their children were born into slavery automatically, following the condition of the mother. This was not temporary servitude with an end date. It was a permanent inherited condition enforced by law across the southern states. The Constitution itself protected this system. Article 4, Section 2 required that any person held to service or labor who escaped to another state had to be returned to whoever claimed to own them. The 3/5 compromise counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person when calculating a state's population for representation in Congress and direct taxation. This gave slaveholding states more political power without granting enslaved people any actual rights. Federal law and southern state laws reinforced the idea that black people, whether enslaved or free, existed outside the protection of citizenship. This legal framework was not a side issue. It was central to how the nation functioned economically and politically. In 1790, slavery appeared to be declining in some parts of the country. Northern states had begun gradually freeing enslaved people. The international slave trade was scheduled to be banned by 1808. Many slaveholders in the Upper South, states like Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, grew tobacco, which required less labor than it had in earlier decades. Some economists and plantation owners believed slavery might eventually disappear. Then, in 1793, a Massachusetts inventor named Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin. The cotton gin was a simple machine. It separated cotton fibers from seeds, a task that had previously been done by hand and took huge amounts of time. One person operating a cotton gin could process as much cotton in a day as 50 people working by hand. This made short staple cotton, which grew well throughout the interior South, suddenly very profitable. Cotton production exploded. In 1790, the United States produced less than 3,000 bales of cotton. By 1820, production exceeded 300,000 bales. By 1860, that number had grown to more than 4 million bales. Cotton became the most valuable export in the United States, worth more than all other exports combined. This explosion in cotton production created an enormous demand for labor. Growing cotton required planting, constant weeding, and above all, picking, endless hours of backbreaking work under the sun. Plantation owners needed more workers, and under the chattel system that meant more enslaved people. After Congress banned the international slave trade in 1808, the domestic slave trade expanded dramatically. Slave traders bought people in the Upper South and transported them to the deep South states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, where new cotton plantations were spreading rapidly. This was not a small operation. Historians estimate that more than 1 million enslaved people were forcibly moved from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860. Families were destroyed. Children were sold away from parents. Husbands and wives were separated, often never seeing each other again. The Upper South and Deep South developed different economic systems, but both depended entirely on slavery. In the Upper South, tobacco farming continued alongside wheat and other crops. Some slaveholders rented out enslaved people to work in cities or on construction projects. Others sold people south when they needed money. Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky essentially became suppliers of enslaved people to the expanding cotton regions. The Deep South, by contrast, was dominated by large cotton plantations. These operations generated massive profits, but also involved extreme violence. Enslaved people worked in supervised groups called gangs, and overseers used whipping and other brutal punishments to force productivity. The workday often ran from sunrise to well after sunset, especially during harvest season. The internal slave trade became a major industry. Professional slave traders ran auction houses in cities like Richmond, Charleston, and New Orleans. They moved people in coffles, groups chained together and forced to march hundreds of miles on foot, or crammed them onto ships for transport along the coast. Enslaved people lived in constant fear of being sold. The threat of sale was used as punishment and control. Even those who were not sold watched as relatives and friends vanished. The psychological and emotional damage was devastating. By the 1850s, political tensions over slavery were reaching a breaking point. The United States had expanded westward, and every new territory raised the same question. Would slavery be legal there? Slaveholders demanded federal protection for their property, even in states and territories where slavery was banned. Free states, meanwhile, resented being forced to participate in the slave system. These tensions exploded with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act was part of the Compromise of 1850, a set of laws designed to reduce conflict between North and South. In exchange for admitting California as a free state, Congress passed a harsh new law to help slaveholders recapture people who had escaped to the North. The law gave the federal government power to enforce slavery nationwide. It created federal commissioners to handle fugitive cases. These commissioners were paid $10 if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder, but only $5 if they ruled in favor of the accused person. This payment structure created a clear financial incentive to side with slave catchers. The law also required ordinary citizens to help capture fugitive slaves if ordered to do so. Anyone who helped a fugitive escape, or even refused to help catch one, could be fined up to $1,000 and imprisoned for up to 6 months. The most damaging part of the law was how it stripped away legal protections. Accused fugitives could not speak in their own defense. They could not request a jury trial. They could not present evidence. A slaveholder or slave catcher simply had to present a written statement claiming ownership, and a commissioner could order the person sent back into slavery. Free black people living in the North, even those who had never been enslaved, were now at risk of being kidnapped and sold south based on false claims. The law made every black person in the United States vulnerable. The Fugitive Slave Act changed many people in the North who had previously stayed neutral on slavery. It forced them to participate directly in the system. Federal marshals could force bystanders to help chase down fugitives. Churches, homes, and public spaces became sites of violent confrontations as slave catchers pursued people through northern cities. In some cases, crowds of abolitionists and free black residents fought back. In Boston in 1851, a group broke into a courthouse and freed a man named Shadrach Minkins, who was then secretly transported to Canada. In Christiana, Pennsylvania, a slaveholder was killed during a confrontation with free black farmers who refused to hand over fugitives. These events became national news and deepened the divide between North and South. For enslaved people, the Fugitive Slave Act made escape far more dangerous. Reaching a free state was no longer enough to guarantee safety. Slave catchers operated openly in cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Some fugitives were captured years after their escape and dragged back south in chains. Free black communities organized vigilance committees to watch for slave catchers, raise money for legal defense, and warn people when danger was near. But the law made one thing clear: nowhere in the United States was truly safe. Canada became the main destination for people fleeing slavery. British law did not recognize slavery, and Canada refused to send fugitives back. Historians estimate that between 30 and 40,000 formerly enslaved people reached Canada between 1850 and 1860. But the journey was long and full of danger. It meant crossing hundreds of miles through hostile territory, avoiding slave catchers, and finding people willing to risk their own lives and freedom to help. The legal and economic structure of slavery created a system in which millions of people were trapped, sold, and worked to death for profit. The Fugitive Slave Act turned the federal government into an enforcer of that system across the entire country. It also made something very clear. For enslaved people seeking freedom, there were no legal options. The courts would not help them. The government would not protect them. Freedom required escape. It required secrecy, careful planning, and a network of people willing to break the law. That network, operating in secret, would become known as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad. There were no tracks, no locomotives, and no scheduled departures. It was a secret network of people, places, and routes that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The system used railroad terms as code language to keep operations hidden from authorities and slave catchers. This language was practical. It allowed people involved in the network to talk in ways that sounded normal to outsiders, but carried specific meaning to those who understood the system. The term station referred to any safe house where fugitives could hide. These were homes, churches, barns, or businesses where people could rest, eat, and wait before moving to the next location. Stations were usually placed between 10 and 20 miles apart, roughly the distance a person could walk in one night. One of the most famous stations sat on a hill in Ripley, Ohio, overlooking the Ohio River. John Rankin, a Presbyterian minister, lived there with his family. Every single night for 40 years, Rankin placed a lit lantern in his hilltop window. That lantern became legendary. Enslaved people in Kentucky, directly across the river and 500 feet below, could see that light shining in the darkness. They knew exactly what it meant and exactly where to aim their boats when they crossed. Slave catchers knew about the lantern too. but they could never catch Rankin doing anything illegal. He was just a man who liked to keep a light burning. What they didn't know was that Rankin's house had multiple hidden rooms, and that more than 2,000 fugitives passed through his home over those 4 decades. That single lantern, visible for miles, guided more people to freedom than most entire networks. A station master was the person who ran the safe house. This person took on serious risk. They fed fugitives, provided shelter, and sometimes gave them clothing or money. If caught, station masters faced the legal penalties outlined in the Fugitive Slave Act: heavy fines, imprisonment, and the destruction of their reputations. Many station masters were ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, who believed that helping people escape slavery was the right thing to do, regardless of the risk. Stockholders were people who funded the network. They donated money to pay for food, clothing, transportation, and legal fees. Some stockholders never directly met fugitives but provided the financial support that kept the system running. Abolitionist groups, churches, and wealthy supporters often acted as stockholders. Their contributions paid for train tickets, bribes, forged documents, and emergency help when fugitives were in immediate danger. The most famous term was conductor. Conductors were the people who guided fugitives from one station to the next. They knew the routes, the safe houses, and the dangers along the way. Conductors travelled with fugitives, sometimes for just one part of the journey, sometimes for hundreds of miles. This was the most dangerous role in the network. Conductors operated in slave states where being caught meant prison or death. They faced violent encounters with slave catchers and criminal charges under federal law. Some conductors made dozens of trips south to lead people out. Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor, made approximately 13 trips and brought around 70 people to freedom. She carried a gun and made it clear to those she guided that turning back was not an option. The safety of the group depended on everyone moving forward. The physical setup of the Underground Railroad relied on hiding spaces built into ordinary buildings. Many safe houses had concealed rooms or compartments designed specifically for hiding people. Basements were common hiding spots. Some homes had false walls installed to create narrow spaces where people could stand or crouch for hours while searches happened. Attics served the same purpose. Fugitives climbed into roof spaces and stayed completely silent while authorities searched the floors below. These hiding spots were cramped, extremely hot in summer, freezing in winter, and required absolute silence. Barns and outbuildings were also used frequently. Haylofts provided cover, and fugitives could be buried under piles of hay when danger was near. Some barns had trapdoors leading to underground hiding spots. The hiding places station masters created were often brilliant in their simplicity. In one Indiana farmhouse, a station master installed a trapdoor in his kitchen floor, directly beneath a massive cast-iron stove. The stove was so heavy, it took 4 grown men to move it. When fugitives needed to hide, the family would lift the stove with a pulley system, open the trapdoor and lower the stove back into place. The hidden room below could hold up to 12 people. Slave catchers searched that house at least 3 times. They walked across that kitchen floor. They looked in every closet, every corner, every barn building. They never thought to move the stove. They never found the people breathing quietly in the darkness just feet beneath where the slave catchers stood drinking coffee, waiting to see if anyone would show up. The family who owned that house fed those hidden fugitives by lowering food through a small gap between the floorboards when the searches were over. Farm wagons with false bottoms were another method of hiding people. A carpenter would build a hidden compartment beneath the visible cargo area. Fugitives lay flat in this space, sometimes for hours, while the wagon passed through checkpoints or travelled through towns in daylight. These false bottom wagons allowed people to move during the day without being seen, which was especially useful in areas with heavy patrols. Churches played a central role in the network. Many had basements or underground burial areas where fugitives could hide for days. Some churches had tunnels connecting to nearby buildings, allowing people to move between locations without appearing on the street. Religious communities, particularly Quakers and some Methodist and Baptist congregations, saw helping fugitives as part of their faith. They organised their members to provide food, clothing and shelter as part of regular church activities, which made the assistance less obvious to outsiders. In major northern cities, free black communities organised vigilance committees. These groups operated openly in some cases and secretly in others. Their purpose was to protect fugitives and free black residents from slave catchers. The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, led by William Still, was one of the most active. Still kept detailed records of the people who passed through Philadelphia, writing down their stories, where they came from, and where they were going. His records, preserved in his book The Underground Railroad, provide some of the most detailed accounts of how the system worked. The committee raised money, arranged transportation, provided temporary housing, and connected fugitives with contacts further north. The New York Committee of Vigilance, founded in 1835, did similar work. The committee posted watchers at docks and train stations to look for slave catchers. When catchers were spotted, the committee spread warnings throughout the black community. They hired lawyers to fight kidnapping attempts in court and organised public protests to draw attention to cases. In several situations, vigilance committees physically stepped in to prevent captures, which led to violent fights with authorities. These committees also provided financial help. Fugitives arrived with nothing. They needed money for food, housing, and continued travel. Vigilance committees collected donations from abolitionist supporters and handed out funds as needed. They bought train tickets to Canada, paid for ferry crossings, and covered the cost of forged freedom papers. Some committees ran job networks, helping newly arrived fugitives find work so they could start rebuilding their lives. Legal support was another important function. The Fugitive Slave Act gave accused fugitives almost no legal defense, but vigilance committees hired lawyers to challenge the process wherever possible. Attorneys filed legal documents demanding that prisoners be brought before a judge, questioned whether ownership papers were legitimate, and created delays that sometimes allowed fugitives to escape before a final decision. These legal battles rarely won in court, but they bought time and occasionally forced slaveholders to give up expensive chases. The Underground Railroad was not run by any single group. It was a diverse network that crossed racial, religious, and regional lines. Free black people were the backbone of the system. They had the most to lose and the strongest personal connections to those still enslaved. Many free black individuals were themselves formerly enslaved, or had family members still in bondage. They opened their homes, donated money, and risked being captured and enslaved themselves by travelling south to guide others out. Free black communities in cities like Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Cincinnati created the organised structures that made large-scale help possible. White Quakers were also heavily involved. The Religious Society of Friends, as Quakers formerly called themselves, had officially opposed slavery since the 1700s. Many Quaker families ran stations along routes through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Levi Coffin, a Quaker from North Carolina who later moved to Indiana, claimed to have helped more than 3,000 fugitives. His home in Fountain City, Indiana, became known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad because of the large number of people who passed through. Other white abolitionists, including Presbyterians, Methodists, Unitarians, and non-religious activists, participated as well. Some were motivated by religious beliefs. Others thought slavery violated the principles of the American Revolution. Still others were driven by personal experiences, having seen the cruelty of slavery firsthand. These individuals contributed in different ways. Some ran stations, others provided money, and some used their social positions to protect the network from being discovered. Surprisingly, some Southerners also participated, though in much smaller numbers. A few slaveholders freed people privately and helped them reach the North. Others, disgusted by the violence and family separations they witnessed, quietly provided information or looked the other way when escapes happened. Some Southern whites who opposed slavery on moral or economic grounds moved to free states and joined the network there. These cases were rare, but they show that opposition to slavery existed even within the South, though it was dangerous to express openly. Native Americans also played a role in some regions. Seminole communities in Florida sheltered fugitives for decades, bringing them into their societies and fighting alongside them against U.S. military forces. In the North, some indigenous groups provided shelter and guidance along routes through difficult terrain. These partnerships were based on shared experiences of being pushed off their lands and resisting federal authority. The network operated without central leadership or coordination. There was no headquarters, no master plan, and no single person in charge. Each station master, conductor, and vigilance committee worked independently, making decisions based on local conditions. Information traveled through personal connections and trusted contacts. This scattered structure made the network strong. If one station was discovered, others kept operating. If one route became too dangerous, people found alternatives. Communication relied on trusted messengers and coded signals. Some homes displayed specific symbols, a lantern in a window, a certain coloured cloth, or a pattern of bricks, to show they were safe houses. Songs contained hidden messages about timing and routes. Letters used vague language that could be understood multiple ways. This secrecy was essential. One careless word, one captured letter, one unreliable contact could lead to arrests, violence, and the shutdown of entire sections of the network. The infrastructure of the Underground Railroad was built on risk. Every person involved faced serious consequences. Station masters could lose their homes and income. Conductors could be killed. Fugitives could be captured and returned to worse conditions than before. Despite these dangers, the network grew throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Thousands of people contributed in ways large and small, creating a system that challenged federal law and directly undermined the institution of slavery. The railroad terms provided a shared language. The physical hiding spaces provided safety. The vigilance committees provided resources and protection. Together, these elements form the structure through which tens of thousands of people traveled toward freedom. Communication on the Underground Railroad had to be invisible to those in power. Enslaved people could not write down escape plans or openly discuss routes. Literacy was illegal for enslaved people in most southern states, and anyone caught with maps or written instructions faced severe punishment. Instead, information traveled through songs, symbols, and signals that appeared harmless to outsiders, but carried vital meaning to those planning escape. These methods were not just clever, they were survival tools that allowed critical information to spread without being detected. Spirituals were religious songs sung in fields, at church gatherings, and during rare moments of rest. To slaveholders and overseers, these songs seemed like simple expressions of faith, but many spirituals contained double meanings. They carried coded instructions about escape routes, timing, and tactics. These songs spread by word of mouth from plantation to plantation, carried by enslaved people who were hired, outsold, or moved between locations. This allowed information to travel across hundreds of miles without anything being written down. One of the most important spirituals was "Follow the Drinking Gourd." The Drinking Gourd was a reference to the Big Dipper constellation, which points toward the North Star. The North Star was the most reliable navigation tool for people traveling at night. It stayed fixed in the northern sky while other stars moved. The song's lyrics provided specific instructions disguised as religious imagery. Lines like, "When the sun comes back and the first quail calls," indicated the best time to begin an escape. "Spring, when the days grew longer and the weather improved." The phrase, "The riverbank makes a very good road," told travellers to follow rivers north, both for navigation and because walking in shallow water helped hide their scent from tracking dogs. Another important spiritual was "wade in the water." The lyrics repeatedly emphasized wading in water, which served a practical purpose. Slave catchers used bloodhounds to track fugitives by scent. These dogs were extremely effective on dry land, but water disrupted the scent trail. By walking through streams, rivers, or swamps, fugitives made it much harder for dogs to follow them. The song also reminded people that God would trouble the water, a reference to biblical stories, but also a reminder that moving water, rivers and streams, provided the best protection from being chased. Enslaved people who heard this song understood it as tactical advice. Stay in the water as much as possible during the early stages of escape. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was another spiritual with hidden meaning. On the surface, it was about death and going to heaven, but chariot was often code for the Underground Railroad itself, and the song signalled that help was coming. When Harriet Tubman was nearby and planning to guide people out, this song might be sung as a signal that the time to leave was approaching. The line, "coming for to carry me home," meant that a conductor was in the area and ready to lead people north. These songs allowed communication in plain sight. Overseers heard enslaved people singing about heaven and dismissed it as religious content, never realizing that escape plans were being coordinated through the lyrics. Steal Away worked similarly. The phrase, "steal away to Jesus," was code for leaving the plantation. When someone sang this repeatedly, or at specific times, it could mean that an escape was planned for that night. The song's urgency, "I ain't got long to stay here," communicated the need to move quickly. These songs were flexible. The same spiritual could be sung as genuine worship one day, and as coded communication the next, depending on the situation and who was listening. The tactical information embedded in these songs was remarkably specific. Songs mention natural landmarks that fugitives should look for, particular rivers, mountains, or types of trees. They indicated which season was safest for travel. They warned about dangers like patrols or specific areas where slave catchers were especially active. This information was essential because most enslaved people had never travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. They had no formal education in geography or navigation. The songs provided a mental map that could be memorized and recalled when needed. Beyond songs, visual signals played an important role in the network. The quilt code is one of the most talked about but also most debated aspects of Underground Railroad communication. According to oral traditions passed down through African American families, specific quilt patterns hung outside homes or on clotheslines carried messages about escape routes and safe houses. Each pattern supposedly had a particular meaning that fugitives could read as they travelled. The log cabin pattern, for example, allegedly indicated a safe house. If this quilt was displayed, it meant the home was operated by someone willing to provide shelter. The wagon wheel pattern supposedly told travellers to pack supplies and prepare for a journey by wagon. The bear's paw pattern indicated a mountain path or trail that should be followed. The crossroads pattern suggested a decision point where travellers needed to choose which direction to go, often toward a town or city where help was available. The flying geese pattern pointed in the direction fugitives should travel, with the triangular shapes indicating north. It is important to note that historians debate the quilt code theory heavily. There is limited written evidence from that time period to confirm that quilts were actually used this way. Most evidence comes from oral histories collected in the 20th century, long after the Underground Railroad stopped operating. Some historians argue that the quilt code might be a later creation, or that it was used in isolated cases but not as a widespread system. Others point out that the absence of written records does not mean the practice did not exist. Secrecy was the entire point, and participants would not have written down their methods. Despite the debate, the quilt code remains an important part of oral tradition within African American communities. Families have passed down stories of ancestors who used quilts to communicate, and these stories form part of the cultural memory of the Underground Railroad. Whether the quilt code was a widespread system or a local practice, it represents the creativity and resourcefulness required to communicate under constant watch. Quilts were common household items that would not raise suspicion, making them ideal for hiding messages in plain sight. Other visual signals were definitely used and are well documented. Lanterns placed in windows were a common signal. A lit lantern in a specific window showed that a house was safe to approach. The absence of the lantern meant danger. Either slave catchers were nearby, or the station was temporarily unavailable. Some homes used coloured fabric or ribbons tied to posts or trees. A white cloth might mean it was safe to approach, while a red cloth signalled danger. These signals changed regularly to prevent slave catchers from learning the system. Certain patterns of stacked firewood or arrangements of stones were also used. A particular way of stacking logs might indicate a safe house, while a different arrangement warned travellers to keep moving. These signals were subtle enough that a casual observer would see nothing unusual, but someone who knew what to look for could read the message clearly. Scouts used bird calls and animal sounds to communicate in areas where verbal communication was too risky. A particular whistle that sounded like a whippoorwill might signal that the path ahead was clear. An owl call could warn of danger. These sounds blended into the natural environment, especially at night when most travel occurred. Fugitives and conductors practiced these calls so they could identify each other without speaking. If someone approaching in the dark gave the correct bird call, they could be trusted. If they did not, fugitives would remain hidden. Some conductors used specific knock patterns on doors to identify themselves. A safe house operator would listen for a particular rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more knocks, for example, before opening the door. This prevented slave catchers from tricking station masters into revealing themselves. Similarly, certain code phrases were used in conversation. If a stranger approached and said "a friend with friends," it identified them as part of the network. These verbal codes worked like passwords, confirming identity without requiring documents or prior face-to-face meetings. The secret language of escape also included how people dressed and presented themselves. Fugitives sometimes disguised themselves to avoid detection. Men dressed as women or the other way around. Light-skinned individuals sometimes posed as white, especially if they had forged freedom papers. Conductors taught fugitives how to act as if they belonged in public spaces, walking confidently, making eye contact, behaving as free people, rather than constantly looking down or appearing fearful. This psychological disguise was just as important as physical disguises. Slave catchers looked for people who seemed out of place or afraid. Acting with confidence could mean the difference between being questioned and being ignored. Written communication, when it occurred, used vague language and false names. Letters between station masters rarely mentioned fugitives directly. Instead, they might refer to packages or freight arriving. A letter saying, "Expect 3 parcels on Tuesday," meant 3 fugitives would arrive that day. If a letter mentioned goods damaged, it indicated someone had been captured or injured. This coded business language allowed station masters to coordinate without creating evidence that could be used in court. The entire system of secret communication reflected the extreme danger everyone involved faced. One mistake, one misunderstood signal, or one betrayed confidence could result in capture, violence, or death. The fact that this communication network worked for decades across thousands of miles, involving thousands of people, demonstrates extraordinary coordination and trust. Enslaved people learned these songs and signals from each other, passing down knowledge that could save lives. Conductors and station masters developed signals that allowed strangers to trust each other in life or death situations. Together, these methods created an invisible network of communication that operated right under the noses of slaveholders and authorities, allowing tens of thousands of people to navigate toward freedom using nothing but songs, symbols, and shared understanding. The Underground Railroad operated in secrecy by necessity. Most participants destroyed evidence, burned letters, and avoided keeping records that could be used against them in court. This secrecy protected lives, but also meant that much of the network's history was lost. A few individuals, however, took the risk of writing down what they witnessed. Their records provide the most detailed accounts we have of how the system actually worked and who it helped. 3 people stand out for their contributions. William Still, who kept detailed records in Philadelphia; Levi Coffin, whose home became the busiest station on the network; and Harriet Tubman, whose smart planning made her the most successful conductor in the railroad's history. William Still is often called the father of the Underground Railroad. He earned this title not by personally guiding the most people, but by leading the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee and documenting the stories of those who passed through the city. Still was born free in New Jersey in 1821. His mother had escaped slavery years earlier, leaving behind 4 children who remained enslaved. Still grew up hearing these stories and understanding the human cost of family separation. In 1844, he moved to Philadelphia, where he eventually became involved in abolitionist work. Philadelphia was a critical stopping point on the Underground Railroad. It sat between the South and Canada, making it a necessary stop for most fugitives traveling north. The city also had a large free black population and an organized abolitionist community. Still began working with the Vigilance Committee in the late 1840s, and by 1851, he was leading it. His job involved coordinating arrivals, arranging transportation to the next destination, raising money, and providing immediate help to people who often arrived with nothing but the clothes they wore. What made Still unique was his decision to keep records. He knew this was dangerous. If authorities raided his office and found these documents, they could be used to prosecute him and others involved in the network. Despite this risk, Still believed the stories needed to be saved. He interviewed fugitives who came through Philadelphia, writing down their names, where they came from, how they escaped, and where they were headed. He documented the conditions they fled, the violence they experienced, and the family members they left behind. He wrote down details about the methods they used and the help they received along the way. Still kept these records hidden during his years working with the Vigilance Committee. After the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, he retrieved them and published a book in 1872 called The Underground Railroad Records. The book contained detailed accounts of hundreds of escapes. It named station masters, described routes, and provided first-hand stories about what fugitives went through. The book served multiple purposes. It documented history that would otherwise have been lost. It honored the bravery of those who escaped and those who helped them. It also helped reunite families. Many people who had been separated during slavery used Still's records to find relatives who had escaped years earlier. Still's records are now one of the most important sources historians have about the Underground Railroad. They provide specific details that oral histories and later memories cannot. They show the variety of people who escaped, men and women, young and old, individuals and entire families. They reveal the creative escape methods and the constant danger everyone faced. Still's work was an act of preserving history that required tremendous courage. He risked his freedom to make sure that future generations would know what happened. Levi Coffin operated from a different position, but with equal impact. Coffin was a Quaker, a member of the Religious Society of Friends, which had officially opposed slavery since the 1700s. Quakers believed in the equality of all people before God and saw slavery as a fundamental violation of human dignity. This religious belief drove Coffin's involvement in the Underground Railroad and justified, in his mind, breaking federal law to help fugitives. Coffin was born in North Carolina in 1798. He witnessed slavery firsthand growing up in the South and was disturbed by what he saw. In 1826, he moved to Newport, Indiana, later renamed Fountain City. He moved specifically to escape the slave economy and to position himself where he could help fugitives. Indiana was a free state, but it bordered Kentucky, a slave state. This made it a natural crossing point for people escaping from the South. Coffin and his wife Catherine opened their home to fugitives immediately after arriving in Indiana. Over the next 20 years, the Coffin home became what Levi later called the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. The house sat where three major routes from the South met. Fugitives arriving from Kentucky, Virginia, and other border states often passed through Newport on their way to Canada. Coffin estimated that he and Catherine helped more than 3,000 people during their time in Indiana. The house had hiding spaces built into its structure, including a second-floor room with a hidden entrance where fugitives could stay for days if necessary. Coffin's work went beyond providing shelter. He organized the local Quaker community to support the effort. Members contributed food, clothing, money, and transportation. Coffin coordinated with other station masters to arrange the next leg of travel. He developed relationships with contacts in cities farther north who could receive fugitives and help them reach Canada. He also worked to protect free black residents from kidnappers who tried to capture them and sell them south by falsely claiming they were fugitives. In 1847, Coffin moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he continued his work on an even larger scale. Cincinnati was a major city on the Ohio River, directly across from Kentucky. Hundreds of fugitives crossed the river into Cincinnati, and Coffin became a central coordinator for helping them. He opened a store that sold goods made by free labor, not slave labor, as a way to economically fight against slavery. He remained active in the Underground Railroad until the Civil War began. Coffin operated more openly than other station masters could. His standing in the Quaker community and his status as a white businessman provided some protection from prosecution, though he was still at risk. He faced legal threats, social hostility from slavery supporters, and financial pressure. But his religious beliefs sustained him. Coffin believed he was following a higher moral law than the federal laws that protected slavery. He saw his work as a religious duty that was more important than the Fugitive Slave Act. This was not unusual within the Quaker community. Many Quakers shared this view and participated in the Underground Railroad for the same reasons. Coffin's contribution was the size and organization he brought to the effort. Harriet Tubman is the most famous conductor in Underground Railroad history, but her story is often simplified to just being brave. While her courage was undeniable, what made Tubman exceptionally effective were her smart methods. She was a strategic planner who thought through every detail of her operations to increase the chances of success and reduce the risk of capture. Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland around 1822. She escaped in 1849 and reached Philadelphia. Many fugitives who reached freedom stayed in the North and built new lives. Tubman made a different choice. She returned to Maryland repeatedly to guide others out, including members of her own family. Over approximately 13 trips, she brought around 70 people to freedom. She never lost a single person under her guidance. This perfect record was not luck. It was the result of careful planning and strict rules. Tubman preferred to operate during winter months. Winter nights were longer, giving a group more hours of darkness to travel. Shorter days meant less time when they might be spotted moving through open areas. Cold weather also meant fewer people were outside, reducing the chances of running into patrols or nosy locals. Winter was harsh. Travelling through snow and freezing temperatures was physically brutal. But Tubman calculated that the tactical advantages were worth the discomfort. She also timed her departures carefully. Tubman started escape trips on Saturday nights. This timing was deliberate. Newspapers did not publish on Sundays, which meant that advertisements for runaway slaves could not appear until Monday at the earliest. This gave her group a full day-and-a-half head start before slaveholders could post descriptions and offer rewards. By the time advertisements ran, Tubman and her group were often 50 miles away or more, far ahead of any organised chase. Tubman carried a gun, not only for protection from slave catchers, but also to enforce discipline within her group. She made it clear that once the journey began, there was no turning back. Anyone who wanted to return would put the entire group in danger by potentially revealing routes or contacts if caught and questioned. Tubman reportedly told those who wavered that they would continue north or die. This sounds harsh, but it was based on practical reality. The safety of the group depended on everyone moving forward. Tubman could not allow doubt or fear to put the mission at risk. One of her most clever tactics involved dealing with infants and small children. Babies could cry at any moment, and a single cry at the wrong time could alert slave catchers or patrols hiding nearby. Tubman carried herbal sedatives, likely preparations containing opium, which was legal and commonly used in various medicines during that time. When the group was hiding and silence was absolutely necessary, she would give small doses to infants to keep them quiet. This practice was risky. The dose had to be precise to avoid harming the child. But Tubman understood medicine from her experiences treating illnesses on the plantation. She used this knowledge to solve a problem that could otherwise doom an entire escape attempt. Tubman also used tricks and disguises. She sometimes dressed as an old woman or a man to avoid being recognized. She traveled through areas where she was known at different times of year when her appearance could be explained in different ways. She carried fake passes or travel documents that allowed her to move more openly in certain situations. She knew the landscape of Maryland's eastern shore extremely well and used that knowledge to choose routes that avoided heavily patrolled areas. Her reputation among enslaved people was legendary. When word spread that Moses, a code name used for Tubman, was in the area, people prepared to leave. Families who wanted to escape waited for her signal. Her success rate gave people confidence that following her meant a real chance at freedom. This trust was hard-earned. Every successful trip added to her credibility and made it easier to recruit people for future missions. Tubman's work extended beyond guiding fugitives. During the Civil War, she served as a scout, spy, and nurse for the Union Army. She used her knowledge of secret operations and Southern geography to gather intelligence behind Confederate lines. She led a military raid on the Combahee River in South Carolina that freed more than 700 enslaved people in a single operation. Her tactical skills, developed during years on the Underground Railroad, translated directly to military operations. What united Still, Coffin, and Tubman was their willingness to take personal risk for the freedom of others. Still risked prosecution by keeping records that could be used against himself and others. Coffin openly defied federal law based on religious principle, accepting the social and legal consequences. Tubman repeatedly entered slave territory, where capture meant death or being enslaved again, relying on careful planning and tactical discipline to survive. These three people represent different aspects of the Underground Railroad: documentation and organization, community support and resources, and direct action on the ground. Together, their contributions show us how the network worked and why it succeeded, despite overwhelming legal and physical opposition. Escaping slavery was not just about avoiding capture. It was a brutal physical test that pushed people to their limits. Fugitives travelled hundreds of miles on foot, often through some of the most difficult terrain in North America. They crossed rivers, climbed mountains, waded through swamps, and walked in complete darkness. Most had never travelled more than a few miles from the plantation where they were born. They had no maps, no compass, and often no clear idea of how far they needed to go. They relied on memory, directions passed through songs and stories, and the guidance of conductors who knew the routes. The journey could take weeks or even months, and every mile brought new dangers. The Ohio River was one of the most important landmarks on the Underground Railroad. It formed the border between the slave states of Kentucky and Virginia and the free states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. For enslaved people in the South, the Ohio River represented freedom. It was often called the River Jordan, a reference to the biblical story of the Israelites crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Reaching the Ohio River meant reaching the boundary between slavery and freedom, but crossing it was far from easy. The river was wide, often more than 1,000 feet across at major crossing points. The current was strong, especially during spring floods, when melting snow and rain raised the water level. Most enslaved people did not know how to swim. Swimming was not taught on plantations, and in many cases slaveholders deliberately prevented enslaved people from learning because it made escape harder. This meant that crossing the river required a boat or help from someone on the other side. During warmer months, sympathetic individuals operated informal boat services at night. Free black residents and white abolitionists living along the Ohio shore watched for signals from the Kentucky side. A lantern flash, a specific whistle, or a prearranged sign showed that someone needed help crossing. These helpers risked severe penalties. Taking fugitives across the river violated the Fugitive Slave Act and could result in prison and heavy fines. Despite this, many people made countless trips across the river under cover of darkness. Winter brought different challenges. When temperatures dropped, the river began to freeze. In some years, the ice was thick enough to walk across. This created an opportunity. Fugitives could cross without a boat. But the ice was unpredictable. It was rarely solid all the way across. Some sections might be thick enough to hold a person's weight, while other sections were thin and could crack. Fugitives had to test each step, moving slowly across the ice in darkness, never certain if the next step would hold. If the ice broke, they fell into freezing water. Without immediate help, hypothermia set in within minutes. Even if they pulled themselves out, their wet clothing would freeze solid. This led to frostbite, often death from exposure. Partially frozen rivers were the most dangerous. When the river was not completely frozen, large chunks of ice floated downstream with the current. These ice chunks moved constantly, creating a shifting maze. Crossing required jumping from one ice piece to another, timing each jump to land on stable ice. Missing a jump meant falling into the freezing water between the ice chunks. Some fugitives waited on the Kentucky shore for days, watching the river and hoping for conditions to improve. Every day of waiting increased the risk of being caught. Once across the Ohio River, fugitives faced new challenges. The Appalachian Mountains stretched across much of the eastern United States, running from Pennsylvania down through Virginia and into the deep South. Getting through or around these mountains was unavoidable for many routes, and the physical toll was severe. The Appalachians are not extremely tall compared to other mountain ranges, but they are steep, rugged, and heavily forested. There were few roads through the mountains in the mid-1800s, and fugitives could not use the roads that did exist without risking being spotted. Instead, they travelled through the woods, climbing up and down steep slopes with no clear paths. The terrain was exhausting. Every step uphill required enormous effort, especially for people who were already weakened by hunger and lack of sleep. Going downhill was equally difficult. Steep descents put tremendous strain on knees and ankles, and loose rocks and roots made it easy to slip and fall. The forest provided cover, but it also made navigation extremely difficult. Trees blocked the view of the sky, making it hard to see the North Star. Dense vegetation hid landmarks. Without clear sight lines, it was easy to walk in circles without realizing it. One group of 7 people experienced exactly this nightmare. They entered the mountains in Western Virginia on what should have been a 3-day crossing. The forest was so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. They tried to navigate by following streams downhill, believing the water would lead them north toward the Ohio River. But mountain streams twist and turn, and without being able to see the sky clearly, they lost all sense of direction. On what they thought was their 3rd day of travel, they passed a distinctive tree that had been split down the middle by lightning. 2 days later, exhausted and nearly out of food, they passed the same tree again. Then, impossibly, they saw it a 3rd time. They had been walking in a massive circle for 5 days and were less than 2 miles from where they had started. One member of the group broke down completely, convinced they would die in those woods. They survived only because a conductor who knew the mountains came looking for them, following marks they had unconsciously left on trees. He found them on the 6th day, delirious from hunger and barely able to walk. Fugitives relied on natural signs to stay on course. Moss growing on the north side of trees, the angle of sunlight coming through the leaves, the flow of streams which generally ran downhill toward larger rivers. But reading these signs required knowledge and experience. Mistakes were common, and getting lost in the mountains could add days to the journey or lead fugitives back toward the areas they were trying to escape. Weather in the mountains was unpredictable and often harsh. Temperatures at higher elevations were much colder than in the valleys below. Rain was frequent, turning the ground into slippery mud and soaking clothing. In winter, snow could fall heavily in the mountains even when lower areas were clear. Wet clothing combined with cold temperatures created a constant risk of hypothermia. A woman named Susan, who escaped through the Great Dismal Swamp and later told her story to William Still in Philadelphia, said the physical hardships were terrible but manageable. The cold she could handle, the hunger she could push through. The worst moment, the one that nearly broke her, happened on her 2nd night in the swamp. She was wading through water in complete darkness, each step uncertain, never knowing if the next step would find solid ground or drop her into a deep hole. She put her foot down on what felt like a fallen log, solid. She started to shift her weight forward. Then the log moved. It slithered away beneath her foot with a horrible smoothness she could feel, even through her worn shoe. She froze, not breathing, not moving, standing on one foot in cold black water, knowing a snake had just passed directly under her, and knowing there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. She stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, listening to her own heartbeat, before she could force herself to take another step. She told Still that even years later, safe in Philadelphia, she sometimes woke up at night feeling that movement under her foot. Fugitives tried to keep moving to generate body heat, but exhaustion eventually forced them to rest. Finding dry shelter was difficult. Caves provided some protection, but they were cold and damp. Hollow logs or thick stands of evergreen trees offered minimal cover from wind and rain. The physical demands of mountain travel were made worse by lack of food. Fugitives could not carry much with them. Some brought small amounts of cornmeal, dried meat, or hardtack, but these supplies rarely lasted more than a few days. They looked for food when possible: berries, nuts, edible plants. But this required knowing which plants were safe to eat. Eating the wrong plant could cause severe sickness or death. As hunger set in, physical weakness increased. Climbing became harder, and the risk of injury from falls grew. Swamps presented an entirely different type of challenge. The Great Dismal Swamp, which stretched across parts of Virginia and North Carolina, was one of the most important hiding places on the Underground Railroad. This massive wetland covered more than 1,000 square miles of dense, waterlogged forest. For fugitives, the swamp offered a critical advantage. Tracking dogs could not follow scent trails through water, and slave catchers on horseback could not chase them into the swamp's interior. The Dismal Swamp had been used as a hiding place by escaped slaves for generations. Communities of fugitives, called Maroons, lived deep in the swamp, sometimes for years. They built small camps on patches of dry ground, surviving by hunting, fishing, and occasionally trading with people on the edges of the swamp. New fugitives heading north sometimes stopped in the swamp to rest and get directions from these established communities before continuing their journey. Life in the swamp was extremely harsh. Most of the ground was covered in water, sometimes just a few inches deep, sometimes several feet. Walking through the swamp meant constantly wading through water, which was cold still and often smelled terrible. The water was dark and murky, making it impossible to see what was beneath the surface. Hidden logs, roots under the water, and deep holes were constant dangers. A wrong step could result in a twisted ankle, a fall into deep water, or worse. The swamp was filled with dangerous wildlife. Venomous snakes, including cottonmouths and rattlesnakes, were common. These snakes could be aggressive when disturbed, and bites were often fatal without medical treatment, which fugitives obviously could not get. Alligators lived in some swamp areas, though they were less common in the Dismal Swamp than in swamps farther south. Insects were perhaps the worst ongoing threat. Mosquitoes swarmed in huge numbers, especially during warmer months. Their bites caused intense itching, but more dangerously, mosquitoes carried diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Fugitives who spent a long time in the swamp often became sick. Finding dry ground to rest was a constant challenge. Most of the swamp was too wet to lie down without getting completely soaked. Fugitives rested standing up, leaning against trees, or tried to find slightly higher patches of ground. Sleep was difficult and rarely lasted more than a few hours at a time. The constant wetness caused skin to break down. Feet developed infections from being in water too long. Clothing rotted and fell apart. The combination of wet conditions, poor nutrition, and physical exhaustion wore people down over time. Navigation through the swamp was as difficult as navigation through mountains. Landmarks were few and constantly hidden by vegetation. The swamp looked the same in every direction, endless trees standing in dark water. Fugitives followed water flow when possible, moving along channels and streams that eventually led out of the swamp. But these routes twisted and turned and were slow to travel. Progress might be only a few miles per day. The mental toll of being surrounded by water, insects and darkness, with no clear sense of progress, was huge. All of these terrain challenges were made worse by the need to travel at night. Fugitives moved in darkness to avoid being seen. This meant dealing with all of these hazards, rivers, mountains, swamps, without being able to see clearly. On cloudy nights when the moon and stars were hidden, the darkness was nearly total. Fugitives walked with arms stretched out to avoid walking into trees. They felt their way along paths, testing each step before putting their weight down. Progress was slow and exhausting. Night travel also meant dealing with cold. Even in regions where days were warm, nights could be very cold, especially in spring and fall. Fugitives wore whatever clothing they had escaped in, which was often not enough for the conditions they faced. Many travelled in thin cotton clothing meant for field work, not for protection against cold. Without being able to build fires, smoke and light would attract attention. They had no way to warm themselves. Frostbite was common. Fingers, toes, and ears were especially at risk. In severe cases, frostbite led to tissue death and permanent injury. Hunger was constant. Most fugitives went days without enough food. Some chewed on bark or grass just to have something in their stomachs. Severe hunger caused weakness, dizziness, and difficulty thinking clearly. It became harder to make good decisions, harder to keep moving, harder to stay alert for danger. The body began breaking down its own muscle for energy, leading to rapid weight loss and physical breakdown. Lack of sleep made all of these problems worse. Fugitives travelled at night and tried to rest during the day, but day rest was never safe or complete. They hid in woods, barns, or caves, always listening for sounds of pursuit. True deep sleep was impossible. Going night after night without real sleep led to seeing things that were not there, poor judgment, and emotional instability. Some fugitives reported seeing things or becoming convinced they were being followed when they were not. The physical journey of the Underground Railroad was an ordeal that pushed human beings to the absolute limit of what they could survive. Every type of terrain presented life-threatening challenges. Rivers could drown them, mountains could break them, swamps could poison them. The darkness itself was a constant danger, yet tens of thousands of people made this journey. They walked through pain, hunger, cold, and fear because the alternative, remaining enslaved, was worse. The physical landscape of the Underground Railroad was not just background to the story. It was an active force that tested every person who attempted the journey and killed many who did not survive. The battle between those seeking freedom and those trying to prevent it was not just physical. It was also about technology and strategy. As the Underground Railroad grew more organized, the systems designed to capture fugitives became more sophisticated. Slave owners and professional slave catchers used every tool available to them: newspapers, trained dogs, rewards, and eventually the telegraph to track down people who escaped. In response, fugitives and their helpers developed creative tactics to avoid capture. This became a constant back and forth, with each side developing new methods to counter the other. Professional slave catchers were a specialized group that emerged as escapes became more common. These were not plantation overseers or local sheriffs. They were men who made their living hunting fugitives for money. Some worked independently, traveling from place to place looking for work. Others were hired directly by slave owners to track specific individuals. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made their work more profitable and more legal. The law allowed them to operate anywhere in the United States, even in free states, and required local authorities and citizens to help them. Slave catchers used several methods to find fugitives. The most common was the newspaper advertisement. When someone escaped, the owner would place ads in local newspapers describing the fugitive in detail. These ads included physical descriptions: height, weight, skin tone, scars, or other identifying marks. They mentioned skills the person had, such as carpentry or blacksmithing, which might show where they would try to find work. The ads often included information about the person's personality, how they spoke, or their habits. Most importantly, they offered a reward for capture and return. Rewards varied widely depending on how valuable the owner considered the individual. A skilled craftsman might have a reward of several $100s, a huge amount at the time. Young, healthy men and women typically had higher rewards than older individuals. The reward amount increased the farther the person traveled. An ad might offer $50 if the person was caught within the county, $100 if caught within the state, and $200 if caught in another state. These rewards attracted bounty hunters and encouraged regular people to report anyone suspicious. Printed posters served a similar purpose to newspaper ads, but were spread more widely. Slave owners printed hundreds of posters and had them posted in public places. train stations, docks, post offices, and taverns. These posters were visual and could be understood even by people who could not read well. They featured large text with the word "run away" or "escaped" at the top, followed by a description and reward amount. Some posters included simple drawings or outlines of the fugitive. These posters stayed up for weeks or months, creating a constant reminder for anyone who might spot the person. The reward system created a financial reason for capture. Professional slave catchers could make good money if they were successful. A skilled catcher might capture several fugitives per year, each bringing a significant reward. This made slave catching attractive to men who were willing to do violent and morally wrong work. It also meant that fugitives could not trust strangers. Someone offering help might actually be a slave catcher looking to collect a reward. Bloodhounds were one of the most effective tools slave catchers used. These dogs were specifically bred and trained for tracking. Bloodhounds have an extraordinary sense of smell, far better than most other dog breeds. They can follow a scent trail that is days old and can track a person across miles of different terrain. Slave owners and catchers spent considerable money acquiring and training these dogs. Training a bloodhound to track humans required specific methods. The dogs were given an item of clothing or bedding that carried the fugitive's scent. The dog would smell the item and then be released to follow that specific scent trail. The dogs could tell the difference between different human scents, allowing them to track one individual even in areas where many people had passed. Bloodhounds were particularly effective because they could track through woods and fields where following footprints was impossible. The dogs were trained to be aggressive but controlled. They needed to chase and corner fugitives without killing them, since dead fugitives had no value to the owner. Handlers trained the dogs to bark and hold a person in place until the catchers arrived. However, in reality, the dogs were often violent. There are documented cases of bloodhounds attacking and seriously injuring fugitives. The sound of barking hounds approaching was terrifying and sometimes caused people to give up rather than risk being attacked. Fugitives developed tactics to counter tracking dogs. The most effective was walking through water. Dogs track by following scent particles that fall on the ground or stick to plants. Water washes these particles away and breaks the scent trail. This is why songs like "Wade in the Water" provided such important advice. Fugitives who spent time walking in streams or rivers could break the trail and force the dogs to lose the scent. However, this only worked if the fugitive stayed in the water long enough and if the catchers did not correctly guess where they would come out of the water. Some fugitives carried strong-smelling substances like onions, garlic, or pepper to hide their scent or confuse the dogs. There are stories of people sprinkling pepper or cayenne behind them as they walked, hoping it would irritate the dogs' noses and make tracking difficult. Whether these methods actually worked is debated, but the fact that people tried them shows how seriously they took the threat of tracking dogs. The introduction of the telegraph in the 1840s dramatically changed how escape and capture worked. The telegraph allowed messages to be sent almost instantly across long distances using electrical signals sent through wires. Before the telegraph, information could only travel as fast as a person on horseback or a letter in the mail. This meant that a fugitive who got several days' head start might reach safety before anyone in the destination city knew to watch for them. The telegraph eliminated this advantage. When someone escaped, the owner could now send a telegram to cities along likely escape routes within hours. The telegram would include a description of the fugitive and instructions to watch train stations, docks, and roads. Local authorities or slave catchers in those cities would receive the information and begin watching for the individual before they even arrived. This technology made long-distance escape much more dangerous. The telegraph also allowed coordination between slave catchers in different regions. If someone was spotted in one city but managed to escape, a telegram could alert catchers in the next city along the route. This created a network of watchers that was far more effective than anything that had existed before. Fugitives and conductors had to adapt by changing routes more frequently, using less obvious paths, and relying more heavily on disguises and false identities. Disguises became essential tools for avoiding capture, especially when travelling through public spaces or using public transportation. One of the most famous examples of successful disguise was the escape of William and Ellen Craft in 1848. Their story shows both the creativity required to escape and the mental courage needed to pull off a dangerous trick. Ellen Craft was light-skinned, the daughter of an enslaved woman and her white enslaver. Her appearance allowed her to potentially pass as white, but this alone was not enough to travel safely. Women travelling alone attracted attention and suspicion. Ellen and her husband William came up with an elaborate plan. Ellen would disguise herself as a young white male plantation owner travelling north for medical treatment. William would pose as his enslaved servant, travelling with him to provide help. The disguise required careful preparation. Ellen cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothing, including a top hat and trousers. She wore dark glasses to hide her eyes, which might give away her nervousness. She wrapped her face partially in bandages, supposedly because of a toothache, which helped hide her features and gave her an excuse not to talk much. Most cleverly, she put her right arm in a sling. This was critical because Ellen could not read or write, and a plantation owner would be expected to sign hotel registers and other documents. The sling gave her an excuse to ask William or hotel clerks to sign for her. With this disguise in place, Ellen and William travelled openly. They bought train tickets and stayed in hotels. They rode on steamboats. At each stage of the journey, they had to maintain their act. Ellen had to behave as a white man would, walking confidently, speaking in a deeper voice when necessary, and treating William as an enslaved person would be treated in public. This last part was mentally difficult. They had to pretend that their relationship was one of owner and property, even though they were husband and wife working together to escape. The journey took several days and covered more than 1,000 miles. They travelled from Georgia through South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and finally to Philadelphia. Multiple times they faced close calls. On one train, a passenger sat near Ellen and tried to start a conversation. Ellen kept her answers short and pretended to be sick to avoid talking. At a hotel, a slave owner looked at Ellen closely, suspicious of his age and appearance, but ultimately believed the disguise. In Baltimore, an officer questioned why William was travelling with his master without proper paperwork, but Ellen's confident manner and appearance as an apparently wealthy white man convinced the officer to let them pass. When they finally reached Philadelphia, they connected with the Vigilance Committee and revealed their true identities. Their successful escape became famous in abolitionist circles and showed that clever planning and bold action could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Their story was published and widely shared, inspiring others but also alerting slave catchers to watch for similar tactics. Other light-skinned fugitives used their appearance to pass as white, though this was always risky. Passing required not just looking white, but acting in ways that matched white social expectations. This meant speaking without the speech patterns common among enslaved people, walking and carrying oneself with confidence, wearing appropriate clothing, and having convincing answers if questioned. Some fugitives carried forged freedom papers claiming to be free people of colour, which allowed them to travel with slightly less suspicion, though free black people were still heavily watched. Passing as white also created complicated feelings. It required leaving behind other fugitives who could not pass. It meant adopting the mannerisms and behaviours of the very people who had enslaved them. Some people felt deep shame or discomfort about using their lighter skin as a tool for escape when others did not have that option. Yet survival often required using every advantage available, and appearance was one of the few advantages the system itself had created through generations of rape and forced reproduction. Men sometimes disguised themselves as women, and women as men to avoid matching descriptions in wanted posters. Fugitives wore wigs, false beards, or padding to change how they look physically. They changed their walk, their posture, and their way of speaking. Some conductors taught fugitives basic acting techniques, how to stay in character under stress, how to answer questions without showing nervousness, how to blend into different social situations. The technological and tactical contest between fugitives and slave catchers was constant and always changing. Every new method of capture led to a new method of avoidance. Newspaper ads led to disguises. Tracking dogs led to water travel. The telegraph led to changed routes and false identities. Professional slave catchers became more organized and better funded, but the Underground Railroad network grew more sophisticated in response. This was not a fair fight. The law, the money, and the violence were all on the side of the slave catchers, but creativity, desperation, and the support of a secret network allowed thousands of people to outmaneuver a system designed to keep them trapped. The contest between capture and evasion was an ongoing race where the stakes were human freedom and the tools were information, deception, and pure determination. For fugitives travelling the Underground Railroad, Canada represented the end of the journey. It was the place where the constant fear of capture finally ended. It was where families could live together without the threat of being sold apart. It was where black people had legal rights and protection under the law. Canada was not perfect. Life there came with its own challenges, but it offered something the United States did not: genuine freedom under the law. The legal foundation for this freedom was the British Imperial Act of 1833. This law abolished slavery throughout the British Empire, which included Canada. The law was clear and complete. Any person who had been enslaved who reached British territory automatically became free. There were no exceptions, no conditions, and no way for former owners to reclaim them. The British government refused to recognise American slavery laws or honour requests to send fugitives back. This meant that the moment a fugitive crossed into Canadian territory, they were legally beyond the reach of slave catchers, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the entire system of American slavery. This legal protection was not just words on paper. The British government actively defended it. When American slave catchers crossed into Canada and tried to kidnap people and drag them back across the border, Canadian authorities arrested the catchers and charged them with kidnapping. British courts consistently ruled in favour of fugitives when disputes came up. This legal certainty made Canada the primary destination for people escaping slavery, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made northern states unsafe. The journey to Canada typically ended at one of several key crossing points along the border. The most famous was Niagara Falls. The border ran along the Niagara River, with the United States on one side and Canada on the other. While many fugitives crossed the river by boat, ferry, or even across the ice in winter, the Niagara Falls Suspension Bridge, completed in 1855, became a powerful new symbol of freedom. Fugitives who reached this bridge could walk across it or hide on trains to enter Canada legally. The atmosphere at the bridge was intense and emotional. After weeks or months of travel, after countless close calls and constant fear, people walked across the bridge knowing that each step took them farther from slavery and closer to freedom. Some fugitives collapsed in tears when they reached the Canadian side. Others fell to their knees and kissed the ground. Many described feeling physically lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from their bodies. The mental impact of reaching safety after living in constant fear cannot be overstated. For the first time in their lives, they could walk freely without looking over their shoulders. They could speak openly without fear of being overheard. They could make plans for the future without the threat of being dragged back into slavery. The Detroit River crossing was another major entry point. Detroit, Michigan sat directly across from Windsor, Ontario. The river was only about half a mile wide at this point, making it one of the easiest border crossings. During warmer months, people crossed by boat. In winter, when the river froze, some walked across the ice. The Detroit River crossing was so heavily used that an entire network of safe houses and helpers operated on the Detroit side specifically to get people across this final barrier. Conductors and station masters often went with fugitives to these border crossings to make sure they made it safely. Harriet Tubman personally escorted many of the people she guided all the way into Canada. She wanted to see them safely across before she considered her mission complete. Other conductors did the same, understanding that the final miles were just as dangerous as the rest of the journey. Slave catchers knew about these crossing points and watched them closely. The moment before crossing was often the most dangerous, with catchers making last-minute attempts to capture people literally steps away from freedom. Once across the border, fugitives found established black communities that had been built by earlier arrivals. These communities understood exactly what the new arrivals had been through and provided immediate help. Churches and mutual aid societies offered food, temporary shelter, and help finding work and permanent housing. These communities also served as information networks, helping people find family members who had escaped earlier, or sending messages back to the United States about successful arrivals. The first documented reactions to freedom varied but shared common themes. Many people described it as being reborn. They felt like different people once they were in Canada. They could make eye contact with white people without risking punishment. They could refuse orders without being beaten. They could negotiate wages for their labor. These simple acts, which free people took for granted, were revolutionary for people who had been enslaved. Some fugitives spent their first days in Canada simply walking around, testing their freedom, experiencing what it felt like to move through the world as a free person. Letters and interviews from this period capture the emotional intensity of these moments. One man described feeling like he could finally breathe properly after years of holding his breath. A woman wrote that she stood in the street and cried for an hour because no one stopped her or questioned what she was doing. A formerly enslaved father wrote about watching his children play without fear, knowing they could never be taken from him. These accounts reveal how deeply slavery had affected every aspect of daily life, and how profound the experience of freedom was. Building a new life in Canada required more than just crossing the border. Fugitives arrived with nothing. Most had no money, no possessions beyond what they could carry, and no knowledge of how to handle life in a new country with different laws, customs, and climate. The established black communities in Canada recognized this and organized to help new arrivals get settled. Several planned black settlements were created specifically for fugitives. One of the most successful was the Elgin settlement, also called Buxton, in Ontario. Founded in 1849 by Reverend William King, a white Presbyterian minister, Buxton was designed as a self-sufficient community where formerly enslaved people could own land, farm, and build permanent lives. The settlement had strict rules. Residents had to purchase their land and could not resell it for 10 years, which prevented quick resales for profit and ensured stable community growth. Residents were required to build quality homes, keep their properties maintained, and send their children to school. Buxton succeeded beyond expectations. Within a few years, it had several hundred residents. They cleared land and established farms that grew wheat, corn, and other crops. They built a sawmill and a grist mill. They established businesses, including a hotel, a store, and various craft shops. Most importantly, they built a school. Education was a priority in Buxton because most residents had been denied the ability to read and write under slavery. The school taught reading, writing, math, and other subjects. It was open to all children in the community and achieved high educational standards. Some students from Buxton went on to higher education, which was extremely rare for black students at that time. The Dawn Settlement, also called the British American Institute, was another important community. Founded in the 1840s near Dresden, Ontario, Dawn focused on agricultural and manual training. The settlement included a school where young men learned trades like carpentry, blacksmithing, and barrel making alongside academic subjects. The goal was to provide residents with marketable skills that would allow them to support themselves financially. Dawn also operated several businesses and became a centre of black political organising in Canada. These settlements represented more than just physical communities. They were proof that formerly enslaved people, given legal freedom and access to resources, could build successful, organised, and self-governing communities. They challenged racist arguments that black people were incapable of taking care of themselves or building civilized societies. The success of Buxton, Dawn, and similar settlements became a source of pride in the abolitionist movement and provided evidence that ending slavery could work. Life in Canada was not without challenges. The climate was harsh, especially for people who had spent their lives in the warmer American South. Canadian winters were brutally cold, with heavy snow and temperatures far below freezing. Many fugitives arrived in summer or fall and had to quickly prepare for a winter, unlike anything they had experienced. They needed warm clothing, heated shelter, and stored food to survive the winter months. Some people struggled with the adjustment. Cold-related illnesses were common in the first years after arrival. Economic opportunities were also limited in some areas. While Canada offered legal freedom, it did not guarantee wealth or easy success. Jobs were not always easy to find, especially in rural areas. Some formerly enslaved people had skills that were in demand. Blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, and cooks could find work relatively easily. Others had only farming experience, which was useful in farming communities but less valuable in towns and cities. Some residents of black settlements struggled to make their land productive, especially in the first years when they were clearing forests and breaking new ground. Social prejudice also existed in Canada, though it was less severe than in the United States and was not backed by law. Some white Canadians held racist attitudes and discriminated against black residents. Black people were sometimes denied service in certain businesses, excluded from certain social spaces, or treated with suspicion and hostility. However, Canadian law protected black people's rights in ways American law did not. If someone was discriminated against, they had legal options. They could take cases to court and expect a fair hearing. This legal protection made a fundamental difference. Despite these challenges, the black communities in Canada grew and did well. By 1860, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 formerly enslaved people lived in Canada. They had established dozens of communities, built hundreds of farms, and created numerous businesses. They published newspapers, organized political groups, and participated in Canadian civic life. They built churches that served as community centers and schools that educated their children. They preserved their culture while also adapting to their new home. Many fugitives maintained connections to the United States even after reaching Canada. They sent letters to family members still enslaved, providing information about routes and conditions. Some saved money to purchase the freedom of relatives who remained in slavery. A few, like Harriet Tubman, returned to the United States repeatedly to guide others out. The black communities in Canada also became bases for abolitionist organizing. People who had escaped gave speeches, wrote books, and told their stories. Their first-hand accounts were powerful tools in the fight against slavery. When the American Civil War began in 1861, many black men from Canadian communities volunteered to fight for the Union Army. They returned to the United States, risking their freedom because they wanted to help end slavery permanently. After the war ended and slavery was abolished, some black Canadians moved back to the United States. They wanted to reunite with family, reclaim property, or participate in Reconstruction. Others stayed in Canada, having built lives and communities they did not want to leave. Canada represented the final destination on the Underground Railroad, but it was also a beginning. It was where people who'd been defined as property became citizens. It was where they could own land, earn wages, educate their children, and live without fear. The black settlements in Canada demonstrated what freedom could mean when it was protected by law and supported by community. The challenges were real. The cold, the prejudice, the economic struggles. But they were challenges that free people could face and overcome for thousands of people who had risked everything to escape slavery. Reaching Canada meant finally being able to live as they had always deserved to live, as free human beings with control over their own lives and futures. The Underground Railroad operated in secrecy for decades, helping tens of thousands of people escape slavery. But the network's ultimate goal was not just individual freedom, it was the complete destruction of slavery as an institution. That goal became possible with the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. The war transformed the fight against slavery from a secret operation into an open military and political battle. Many of the people who had escaped slavery, and many who had helped them escape, played direct roles in this final fight. When the Civil War began, it was not initially fought to end slavery. President Abraham Lincoln and the Union government stated that their goal was to preserve the United States and prevent the southern states from forming a separate nation. Lincoln worried that making the war about slavery would push the border states, slave states that had remained in the Union, like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, to join the Confederacy. Many Northerners supported the war effort to save the Union, but were not willing to fight to free enslaved people. The war's purpose, at least officially, was political, not moral. However, enslaved people and abolitionists understood that the war created an opportunity to end slavery permanently. As Union armies moved into Confederate territory, enslaved people fled to Union lines by the thousands. They left plantations and sought protection from Union forces. This created a practical problem for Union commanders. Were these people still legally enslaved? Should they be returned to their owners? Could they be put to work supporting the Union war effort? Some Union generals began treating escaped slaves as contraband of the war, property seized from the enemy. This legal term allowed the Union to keep them without officially freeing them. Thousands of formerly enslaved people worked for the Union Army as laborers, cooks, wagon drivers, and scouts. They built fortifications, moved supplies, and provided crucial intelligence about Confederate troop movements and local geography. Their labor was essential to Union military operations, and their knowledge of the Southern landscape gave Union forces significant advantages. As the war continued, pressure grew to allow black men to serve as soldiers, not just laborers. Abolitionists, black leaders, and some military commanders argued that black men should be allowed to fight. Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist and formerly enslaved person, pushed this cause aggressively. He argued that black men fighting for the Union would demonstrate their citizenship and humanity. It would make a powerful statement that black people were not passive victims waiting to be saved, but active participants in their own liberation. In 1863, the Union began officially recruiting black soldiers. The most famous of these units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. This was one of the first official black regiments in the Union Army. It was commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, a white officer from a prominent abolitionist family, But the soldiers were black men, many of whom had escaped slavery or were the sons of people who had escaped. The 54th Massachusetts included men who had travelled the Underground Railroad to freedom. Some had lived in Canada and returned specifically to fight. Others had been living in northern free states. They enlisted knowing that Confederate policy stated that captured black soldiers would not be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, they would be executed or returned to slavery. Despite this threat, thousands of black men enlisted. They were willing to risk everything because they understood that this war was their chance to end slavery forever. The 54th Massachusetts proved itself in battle at Fort Wagner, South Carolina, in July 1863. The regiment led an assault on this heavily defended Confederate position. The attack was brutal. The 54th advanced under intense fire, suffering massive casualties. Colonel Shaw was killed. Nearly half the regiment was killed, wounded, or captured. The assault ultimately failed to take the fort, but the courage and discipline displayed by the 54th Massachusetts received national attention. It challenged racist assumptions that black men would not fight well. The performance of the 54th and other black regiments helped shift public opinion in the North and showed that black soldiers were just as capable and brave as white soldiers. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army. Another 19,000 served in the Navy. They fought in major battles across the South. They served in support roles and combat roles. Roughly 40,000 black soldiers died during the war, killed in battle, dead from disease, or executed by Confederate forces after capture. Their service was a crucial part of Union victory, and it fundamentally changed how black people were viewed in American society. While black soldiers fought on the battlefield, the legal status of slavery was being challenged in Washington. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. The proclamation did not apply to border states that remained in the Union or to areas of the Confederacy already under Union control. This meant it did not immediately free all enslaved people. However, it fundamentally changed the nature of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation made ending slavery an official war goal. It transformed the conflict from a war to preserve the Union into a war to end slavery. This had several important effects. It made it much harder for European nations, particularly Britain and France, to support the Confederacy. These nations had abolished slavery decades earlier, and their populations would not support a war to defend slavery. The proclamation also encouraged more enslaved people to escape to Union lines, weakening the Confederate economy and providing the Union with additional soldiers and laborers. The night of January 1st, 1863, became one of the most emotional in American history for black communities across the North. Lincoln had promised the proclamation would be signed on New Year's Day, but he had not said when. No one knew if he would actually go through with it. Throughout the day, no news came. As evening fell, black churches and community halls filled with people waiting. In Boston, a crowd gathered at Tremont Temple. They waited through the afternoon. They waited through dinner time. They waited as the sun set and darkness came. Frederick Douglass was there, standing near the front. Hour after hour passed with no word. Some people began to lose hope, wondering if Lincoln had changed his mind. Finally, at nearly 11 o'clock at night, a man ran into the hall shouting that the telegraph had just confirmed it. Lincoln had signed the proclamation. The room erupted. Frederick Douglass, a man known for his powerful speaking and firm composure, openly wept. People who had been sitting for hours jumped to their feet. Strangers embraced. The crowd began singing, first one hymn, then another, then patriotic songs, then spirituals. They sang until dawn broke, their voices carrying out into the Boston streets. Similar scenes played out in black communities across the North. People stayed awake all night, not in celebration of a party, but in recognition that something fundamental had shifted. The law had finally acknowledged what they had always known, that they were human beings who deserved freedom. The proclamation had limits, though. It was a military order issued under the president's war powers. It could potentially be challenged in court after the war ended. It did not apply to all enslaved people, only those in rebel states. Most importantly, it could be reversed by a future president or Congress. Abolitionists understood that permanent freedom required a constitutional amendment, a change to the fundamental law of the nation that could not be easily undone. The push for a constitutional amendment began even before the war ended. Abolitionists, Republican politicians, and formerly enslaved people lobbied Congress to pass an amendment that would abolish slavery everywhere in the United States permanently. The proposed amendment was simple and clear. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The amendment passed the Senate in April 1864, but it initially failed in the House of Representatives. There was not enough support to reach the two-thirds majority required for constitutional amendments. Lincoln made passage of the amendment a priority. He used his political influence to pressure representatives. He argued that the amendment was necessary to make the Union's victory meaningful. Finally, on January 31st, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment by the required two-thirds majority. The scene in the House chamber that day was unlike anything Congress had witnessed before, or has witnessed since. When the final vote was announced, 119 in favour, 56 against, the chamber exploded with emotion. Representatives threw their hats in the air. Men who had spent years fighting for this moment embraced each other openly on the House floor. The public galleries, packed with spectators who had waited hours for this vote, erupted in cheers and applause. Women waved handkerchiefs. Some people openly sobbed. The sergeant-at-arms, whose job was to maintain order and silence in the galleries, made no attempt to quiet anyone. He stood at his post with tears running down his face and let the chaos continue for 10 full minutes. Outside the Capitol building, a crowd that had gathered to wait for news heard the cheers from inside and knew what had happened. Church bells across Washington began to ring, cannons fired in, celebration. That night, the White House was lit up with candles in every window, and crowds gathered outside singing. It was not a military victory being celebrated, though the war was nearly won. It was the legal death of an institution that had existed in North America for more than 200 years. Everyone present understood they were witnessing a turning point in history. The amendment then needed to be approved by 3/4 of the states. This process took most of 1865. Southern states that wanted to be readmitted to the Union were required to approve the amendment as a condition of readmission. On December 6, 1865, Georgia became the 27th state to approve the amendment, reaching the required 3/4 threshold. The 13th Amendment became part of the Constitution. Slavery was now illegal throughout the United States. The legal institution that had existed since the colonial period was finally abolished. This was the moment the Underground Railroad had been working toward. The secret network of conductors, station masters, and safe houses had operated for decades to help individuals escape. Now the entire system of slavery was destroyed by law. Every enslaved person in the United States was legally free. There was no more need for secret routes to Canada. There was no more need to hide fugitives in basements and attics. The mission was complete. The end of slavery meant the end of the Underground Railroad. The network simply dissolved. There was no formal closing ceremony or final meeting. People who had risked their lives for years simply stopped because their work was done. Station masters returned to their normal lives. Conductors focused on other activities. The safe houses that had hidden fugitives became ordinary homes again. Some of the major figures in the Underground Railroad continued working for black rights after slavery ended. William Still remained active in Philadelphia's black community. He continued advocating for civil rights and supporting institutions that served black residents. He published his detailed records of Underground Railroad operations in 1872, preserving crucial historical information and helping families find relatives who'd been separated. Harriet Tubman's work did not end with the war. She had served as a scout, spy, and nurse for the Union Army during the conflict. After the war, she settled in Auburn, New York, where she had lived before the war. She continued advocating for women's rights and black civil rights. She established a home for elderly and poor black people. She supported schools and churches. She lived until 1913, long enough to see the next generation of black Americans growing up in legal freedom, though still facing enormous challenges. Levi Coffin continued his work as well. He travelled throughout the South after the war, helping to establish schools and institutions for formerly enslaved people. He worked with organizations that provided relief and support during the difficult Reconstruction period. He remained committed to the cause of black equality until his death in 1877. The formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Canada faced a choice. They were now free to return to the United States if they wanted. Some did return. They wanted to reunite with family members they had left behind. They wanted to help with the enormous task of reconstruction, rebuilding the South and integrating millions of formerly enslaved people into society as free citizens. Some returned to reclaim land or property they had been forced to leave. Others wanted to participate in politics, to vote and hold office in ways that had been impossible before. However, many black Canadians chose to stay in Canada. They had built lives there. They had homes, farms, businesses, and communities. Their children had been born in Canada and considered it home. The communities at Buxton, Dawn, and other settlements continued to exist and grow. Some people worried, correctly, that the end of slavery would not mean the end of racism or violence against black people in the United States. Canada still offered protections and opportunities that the United States did not guarantee. The period immediately following the war, known as Reconstruction, was a time of both hope and danger. The 13th Amendment was followed by the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all people born in the United States regardless of race, and the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed black men the right to vote. These amendments represented enormous legal progress. For a brief period, black men served in Congress, in state legislatures, and in local governments across the South. Schools were established for black children. Families separated by slavery were reunited. People who had been considered property were now citizens with legal rights. However, this progress faced violent opposition. White supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, used terrorism to prevent black people from exercising their rights. They burned schools and churches. They murdered black political leaders and white allies. They used economic pressure, legal tricks, and outright violence to restore white political control. By the 1870s, Reconstruction was failing. By the 1890s, Southern states had effectively stripped black people of their voting rights through literacy tests, poll taxes, and violence. A new system of racial oppression known as Jim Crow emerged to replace slavery. The end of the Underground Railroad marked the end of one phase of the struggle for black freedom, but it was not the end of the struggle itself. The network had achieved its immediate goal, the legal abolition of slavery, but the larger goal of genuine equality and justice remained unfulfilled. The courage, organization, and determination that had sustained the Underground Railroad would be needed again in future generations, as Black Americans continued fighting for the freedom and dignity that the law promised but society still denied. The Underground Railroad's legacy was not just in the thousands of individuals it helped escape. It was in showing that organized resistance to injustice was possible, that ordinary people could challenge powerful systems, and that freedom was worth any risk. The Underground Railroad operated for roughly 70 years, from the late 1700s through the end of the Civil War in 1865. During that time, thousands of people risked everything to escape slavery, and thousands more risked their freedom and safety to help them. The exact number of people who successfully escaped via the Underground Railroad will never be known. Estimates range from 30,000 to 100,000 people, but these are educated guesses, not precise counts. The reason for this uncertainty is simple. Secrecy was essential to the railroad's operation. Station masters did not advertise their involvement. Conductors did not keep public records of their trips. Fugitives used false names and avoided leaving paper trails. Most communication was spoken, passed from person to person without written documentation. This secrecy protected everyone involved from prosecution under the Fugitive Slave Act. But it also means that much of the railroad's history was never recorded. William Still's records from Philadelphia provide some of the best documentation we have, but they represent only one city on one set of routes. Dozens of other routes existed across the country, each with its own network of helpers and safe houses. Most of these networks left no records at all. We know they existed because of oral histories, family stories passed down through generations, and occasional mentions in letters or newspapers, but we do not have detailed accounts of how they operated. The number of people who attempted escape but did not succeed is even harder to estimate. Many people were captured during their journey and returned to slavery. Some died from exposure, hunger, or violence. Others got lost and had to turn back. For every person who successfully reached Canada or a northern safe haven, there were likely others who tried and failed. The true scale of the Underground Railroad includes not just those who succeeded, but all those who had the courage to try. Despite the incomplete historical record, the Underground Railroad's impact on American history is undeniable. It demonstrated that slavery could be resisted. It created networks of cooperation that crossed racial and religious lines. It saved thousands of lives and gave thousands of families the chance to live in freedom. It also kept the moral question of slavery at the center of national conversation, making it impossible for Americans to ignore the fundamental injustice at the heart of their society. The legacy of the Underground Railroad is remembered and honored in multiple ways. One of the most significant is Black History Month. In the United States and Canada, February is designated as Black History Month, a time to recognize and celebrate the contributions of Black people to history and culture. The choice of February was deliberate and symbolic. February was chosen because it includes the birthdays of two crucial figures in the fight against slavery. Abraham Lincoln, who issued the Emancipation Proclamation and pushed for the 13th Amendment, was born on February 12, 1809. Frederick Douglass, the most famous formerly enslaved person and abolitionist in American history, celebrated his birthday on February 14th. Douglass did not know his exact birth date. Enslaved people were often not told when they were born, so he chose February 14th as his symbolic birthday. The selection of February honors both of these men and their contributions to ending slavery. Black History Month began as Negro History Week in 1926. It was founded by Carter G. Woodson, a historian and scholar who was the second Black American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. Woodson was concerned that Black history was being ignored and erased from mainstream education. history textbooks barely mentioned slavery and said almost nothing about black people's contributions to American society. Woodson believed that if black children did not learn their own history, and if white children did not learn about black contributions, racism and ignorance would continue unchallenged. Woodson established Negro History Week to encourage the teaching of black history in schools and communities. He chose the second week of February to match up with the birthdays of Lincoln and Douglas. The week included programs, lectures, and educational events focused on black history. Schools were encouraged to teach units on black contributions to science, arts, politics, and culture. Churches and community organizations held special events. Negro History Week grew in popularity over the decades. In 1976, during the United States bicentennial celebration, the week was expanded to the entire month of February. It became Black History Month, and it has been observed every February since then. Canada officially recognized Black History Month in 1995. The month serves as a reminder to study and honor black history, not just as a separate topic, but as a key part of North American history. The Underground Railroad is a central story taught during Black History Month. It represents courage, resistance, and cooperation. It shows that ordinary people, working together, can challenge powerful and unjust systems. The story resonates because it is not just about the past. It connects to ongoing struggles for justice and equality. The influence of the Underground Railroad extended beyond North America. The story of organized resistance to slavery inspired other movements for justice around the world. In the United Kingdom, where many formerly enslaved people settled after escaping through Canada, the story of the Underground Railroad became part of the broader story about slavery's end and its lasting effects. Black communities in Britain drew connections between the resistance of enslaved people in America and the struggles of colonized people in Africa and the Caribbean. The tactics and organizational methods of the Underground Railroad also influenced later civil rights movements. The idea of a secret network working against an unjust legal system appeared again in various forms. During World War II, resistance movements in occupied Europe used similar tactics: safe houses, coded communication, ordinary citizens risking their lives to hide and transport people targeted by oppressive governments. While these movements did not directly copy the Underground Railroad, the similarities are clear. The Underground Railroad demonstrated that networks of ordinary people could effectively resist state power through careful organization, secrecy, and moral commitment. In the United States, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s drew direct inspiration from the Underground Railroad. Civil rights activists saw themselves as continuing the work that abolitionists had begun. They used similar strategies, building networks across racial lines, creating safe spaces where organizing could happen, and using moral arguments to challenge unjust laws. Civil rights workers spoke about the Underground Railroad as a model of multiracial cooperation toward justice. The Freedom Riders, who rode buses through the South to challenge segregation, consciously echoed the conductors who had guided people to freedom a century earlier. The Underground Railroad stands as perhaps the first major multiracial, multi-religious civil rights movement in North America. It brought together people from vastly different backgrounds who shared a common belief that slavery was wrong and that resisting it was right. Free, black people and formerly enslaved people formed the core of the network, but they were joined by white Quakers, Presbyterians, Methodists, and non-religious abolitionists. Jewish families participated in some regions. Native American communities provided help in certain areas. Poor farmers and wealthy merchants both contributed. This diversity was one of the railroad's greatest strengths. The cooperation across racial and religious lines was not always easy. There were tensions and disagreements. Some white abolitionists talked down to black activists. Some believed they should lead the movement because they had education and social standing. Black activists often had to fight for equal recognition and decision-making power within abolitionist organizations. Despite these tensions, the network functioned because people focused on their shared goal. They recognized that ending slavery required everyone's efforts and that internal conflicts could not be allowed to stop the mission. This model of diverse people working together toward justice became a template for future movements. It showed that social change does not require everyone to agree on everything. It requires agreement on the main goal and willingness to work together despite differences. The Underground Railroad proved that coalitions could be effective even when participants came from different backgrounds and had different motivations. The physical sites connected to the Underground Railroad have been preserved and marked across North America. Homes that served as safe houses have been turned into museums. Routes have been identified and commemorated. The National Park Service in the United States operates the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, which identifies, preserves, and promotes sites related to the Underground Railroad. In Canada, similar efforts have preserved locations significant to the railroad's history. These preservation efforts ensure that future generations can connect with this history in real ways. Sometimes, history reveals itself when we least expect it. In 2011, a couple in Delaware bought an old house built in the 1850s. They planned to renovate it. While tearing down a wall in what they thought was a storage closet, they discovered something strange. The closet was too shallow. The back wall seemed too close to the front wall, leaving several feet of space unaccounted for. They knocked through the back wall and found a hidden room that had been sealed since before the Civil War. The room was tiny, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and only the one entrance that had been completely covered over. Inside, untouched for more than 150 years, were objects that told a story. Several old blankets folded in a corner, a dented tin cup, a child's wooden toy horse with one leg broken off, a pair of shoes so worn through that the soles had holes, and carved into the wooden wall, scratched there with something sharp, were names and a date. Grace, Moses, Samuel, headed North July 1856. Researchers confirmed that the house had belonged to a Quaker family known to have abolitionist sympathies. Grace, Moses, and Samuel had hidden in that tiny airless room, probably for several days, waiting for the next leg of their journey. They had carved their names perhaps to leave a record that they had existed, that they had been there, that they were real people with identities and hopes. The toy horse suggested at least one of them was a child, maybe Moses or Samuel. The researchers searched records and found documentation that 3 people matching those names had successfully reached Canada in August 1856 and had settled in a community near Toronto. Grace, Moses, and Samuel made it. They survived the room, survived the journey, and lived as free people. Their names, carved in darkness while they waited in fear, survived to tell us their story 155 years later. But the most important legacy of the Underground Railroad is not in the buildings or the marked historical sites. It is in the example it set. The Underground Railroad demonstrated that moral courage can take many forms. For conductors like Harriet Tubman, it meant repeatedly entering slave territory to guide others out. For station masters, it meant opening their homes to strangers and risking legal consequences. For the fugitives themselves, it meant walking away from everything familiar and journeying into the unknown with no guarantee of success. The railroad showed that systems of oppression, no matter how powerful, are never absolute. There are always cracks, always spaces where resistance can happen. Slavery was protected by federal law, enforced by armed patrols, and defended by enormous economic interests. Yet thousands of people escaped because other people were willing to help them. The system was not unbreakable. It could be challenged, resisted, and ultimately destroyed. The story of the Underground Railroad is fundamentally a story about human dignity. It is about people who refused to accept the legal label of property and insisted on their humanity. It is about people who saw others suffering and decided to help, even when helping was illegal and dangerous. It is about communities that formed around the simple principle that freedom is a universal right, not a privilege granted to some and denied to others. When we remember the Underground Railroad, we remember the individuals who followed the North Star through dark forests and across frozen rivers. We remember the families who were reunited after years of separation. We remember the conductors who made trip after trip, knowing each journey could be their last. We remember the station masters who kept lanterns burning in their windows as signals of safety. We remember the Vigilance Committee members who raised money and hired lawyers. We remember everyone who contributed, in ways large and small, to the cause of freedom. Their legacy is not just historical, it is present in every movement for justice that followed. It is present whenever people organize to challenge injustice. It is present whenever someone takes personal risk to help another person escape danger or oppression. The tactics may change, the specific issues may differ, but the basic principle remains the same. Freedom is worth fighting for, and achieving it requires courage, cooperation, and an unwavering belief in human dignity. The people who built and used the Underground Railroad did not have the certainty of knowing they would succeed. They could not see the end of slavery from where they stood. They only knew that staying silent and doing nothing was unacceptable. They acted on faith, faith that their efforts mattered, faith that freedom was possible, and faith that future generations would continue the work they began. That faith was justified. Slavery ended. The people they helped lived in freedom and built communities. Their descendants, and all of us who benefit from living in a world where slavery is no longer legal, owe them an enormous debt. We honor that debt by remembering their stories, by teaching them to new generations, and by continuing to work toward the full achievement of the freedom and equality they fought for. The journey they began is not finished, but because of their courage, we know it is possible. The North Star still guides us toward justice. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing, and tell me in the comments, which empire or historical event should we explore in our next timeline? Sleep well and good night.